Hi, this video is about working with selectors with Playwright. We'll look at what selectors are, how to get them, and how to use them right. Pause now if you would like more information. Okay, let's go. When it comes to Playwright or any other UI automation tool, we are looking to automate a user interface. A user interface is normally composed of different elements, and to interact with those elements, we first need to find a way to point to them, to reference them, to select them. This is what selectors do. They allow us to select this button, this search field, this menu item, and many other things. What we're looking at is Danube, our demo website, loaded in Chrome. Let's say we want to interact with this login button up here. We need to find a way to select it, to point at it, a selector in other words, right? So since we're here in our Chrome browser, what we can do is just bring up, by right-clicking and clicking inspect, the suite of tools that we definitely need to become familiar with, and that is the Chrome DevTools. We're looking at them right here. So the Chrome DevTools are extremely useful when it comes to finding and testing out selectors, among other things. So the easiest way to get started here is, I would say, clicking this element in the top left part of the tab, and then you can actually go around, move your cursor around the page, and you will have all the different elements highlighted in real time. And what we can do here, for example, is select this login button, and we immediately see the element highlighted in the DOM, in the document object model. And here we find already a host of very useful information for us to build a selector. So first of all is, of course, the actual element type, let's say. So we have a button here. This is a button HTML tag, right? Of course, what we could do is just select a button, right? Search for a button and hope that the button that we end up selecting is the right one, but it doesn't really work that way. So normally, if you're looking for an element, what will happen is you will get back the first element that matches a set of criteria. That means that if I just go and look for a button, it's probably not the login button that will come up. So actually there's a way to test that, by the way. I can just go here and select console, and here I can actually write my query. And I'm gonna do document.query selector. And this is how we actually search for an element in the page using a CSS selector. So here what I can do is just enter button. And as you can see, the DevTools are already highlighting this button for me, right? That would be the actual result here of my search. The problem is that is the wrong button. We wanted to select login, right? So of course we could do something a little bit different. We could say, hey, get me the second button, right? We could actually query for multiple elements. We could do query selector all, and then do button. And this gives me multiple buttons. And among these, you can see we already have our login button. But of course, what we can do is just come up with a selector that will give us, that will return the actual button that we're looking for, right? Out of the box. So I can do well, actually, let's first take a second look at this login button. Again, in inspection mode, we go back, we see what the element looks like. We see that aside from being a button and having a data attribute here that is probably automatically generated, we can kind of guess that by the fact that it has this letter and symbol alphanumeric string attached to it, right, which doesn't seem like a human would like to define and or to use. It also has an ID. Okay, an ID is a very interesting thing. An ID is, in valid HTML, a unique value. And a unique value is exactly what we're looking for. If we have a unique value to query for, that means we would be selecting just the right button. Okay, let's try it out on the page before we go and add it to our script. Just gonna do a document.query selector. Put login in there. That would not work. Why? Because this is not how you specify an ID in CSS. You actually need to add the hash symbol. right in front of it. And now you can see already in the preview that this button is going to come up. Let's press enter here. And you can see that the right button is being highlighted. Okay, that's cool. We kind of have tested then our first selector already. So let's start writing a script to actually try out a few selectors. So first of all, I'm gonna copy the URL for Danube here. I have a little script here already prepared. I'm gonna do an await page.goto, and that essentially loads a URL, right? So we can try that out real quick. Always try out your scripts continuously, right? Make sure that you don't introduce mistakes early on. So we can actually make this headful so that we can see what happens. Take care of that. And here we go. Okay, we see everything seems to be working just fine. Now, what we could do is go here and let's say click an element. We want to click, in this case, our login button. I'm gonna look for the wrong selector, right? So we forget our hash symbol on purpose. We're gonna go ahead now and run the script. This will terminate, but not immediately. Why? Because Playwright has built-in waiting mechanisms, right? So here you can see the script is still hanging. The default timeout is 30 seconds. So after 30 seconds, we should see an error coming up here. We're gonna speed this up a little bit. And we have our error here. So timeout 30 seconds exceeded, waiting for selector login, that never showed up. All right, fine. That's totally understandable. That was the wrong selector. Let's actually run that with hash login. And now we see we actually are able to click that element. Of course, here things were a little bit quick, right? What we can do is introduce a little timeout, which would then enable us to see what's going on. What we could also do, which is maybe a little bit better, is do an await page.pause. Let's see what that does. All right, that brings up the Playwright inspector, which is also a great tool to troubleshoot and debug our scripts, but also to potentially explore the page and get already pretty interesting selector suggestions, right? That we might want to use. So in this case, though, we're not going to use the Playwright inspector. What we want to do is just see what happens here, and what we can see is that after the click goes through, we are actually moving forward, right? So we have now this modal that comes up, of course, after clicking login. So that went through. That click action went through, which means that our selector actually worked. So let's say that we want to keep going and we want to automate this login flow, right? Now we are looking for the next selector, right? We will need to interact with this email field, the password field, the sign in button, right? So how do we go about that? Well, again, we can repeat the same procedure. I can go and essentially use the inspector here within my browser, select the next element I need to interact with, and well, here we have a few different things that we can use, right? So we have an ID there, and let me make this a little bit bigger. And we have a type text, right? We have a placeholder email, we have a class here. So what can we do? Can we use the class, for example, for this one element? Let's see. Well, I can test it out, right? So testing the selectors is extremely important. You want to always test your selectors. Let's do a query selector here. Of course, this is not going to work. So we are using a class selector in this case, and in CSS syntax that comes with a dot in front of it, right? Perfect. Look at that. We are getting the first of the two fields, which is great. That's exactly what we want to select. You can see that that's exactly our target, but this is not actually a unique class. So I can do query selector all. You see there's a node list of size 2 there, and the second field is also selected, right? This might be okay, might not be okay, right? What if the order of the elements changes, right? We are just relying on the fact that the right one comes first. That might be maybe fine in this case, because it's a pretty straightforward modal. But what if, let's say, we have an additional field that gets introduced before email? Maybe it's just our name or username or something like that. Our script maybe might then end up writing an email instead of a username or whatever comes before that, right? So let's look for something a little bit more unique. You're always looking for unique things, right? So of course we could default to the ID, right? That's your go-to. If it's there, it's probably the best thing that you can do. In this case, let's pretend that that is actually not there, right? Let's just say that this is completely unavailable. I'm just gonna delete it from our element here. And let's maybe use placeholder email, right? It doesn't look like there's anything else with that with this attribute, right? So I'm just gonna try it out. So do document query selector all in this case, and I want only one of these to be returned. Actually, here we have a specific syntax. I could just do placeholder equals email, right? And we would have, in this case, a node list because I did the query selector all, which returns, again, a list of elements. But there is only one element inside, and it's the right one, right? Okay, that's great. So essentially, I could take this and put it into my script. Let's try it out. Okay, let's just add a small delay instead of the full-blown page.pause at the very end. I just want to take a couple of seconds to look at the result and see if our command is doing what it's supposed to do. So we can do a page.wait for timeout and put 3 seconds there. Don't ever use page wait for timeout, any sort of sleep-like wait for scripts that need to go live, that need to run in production, right? This is just something that you use when writing a script as something that you use for convenience, right? Once you're done with writing the script, none of these should be in there, and we're gonna be removing that in a second. All right, so save my script, run it. Just gonna do a node script.js. All right, everything looks fine, right? So the email is entered correctly. That was the right selector once more. So in this case, again, we're looking for any element that has attribute placeholder with value email. All right, that's cool. What about the next thing? Well, we want to enter an email, right? Okay, in this case, we have something interesting here. You see, the last element was of type text. There might be multiple element with type text, but in many cases, you might have only one password, right? And in this case, again, let's ignore the fact that we have an ID, right? So let's pretend the ID is not available, which is something that will happen to you if you spend enough time automating application. So in this case, I'm gonna pretend that ID is not there. Devs have not been kind enough to give us an ID, and I'm gonna remove the placeholder as well, which otherwise would be maybe our second choice, right? And what we're gonna do instead is just use then the type password. So we can try that out. And that actually did not work. Why did that not work? Well, let's go back. We actually didn't test this. We kind of assumed that there would only be one password available in there, or one element of type password. And well, we could have seen here that that was not the case, but this actually teaches us an important lesson, or well, a couple actually. So first of all, we always want to make sure that we have tested our selector, right? So let's run here a query selector all on input type password, and we see again there's two nodes. So there is our node here, the input that we actually wanted to select, and there is a hidden input. If we go back to our Elements tab now, we can actually see the other elements. So of course, we should have tested this out. That's the first lesson, and the second lesson is, well, you might be automating a website that is not, following all of the best practices. There might be things that don't immediately make sense to you, right? So here, when I implemented this some time ago, I followed some workaround, right? I don't remember much about it anymore, but there is a disabled input field here, right? And even though I don't see it as a user, Playwright is gonna see it. And when I ask it to give me the first input of type password, it's gonna return that, right? And that's not what we want. So in this case, we need to find an alternative solution. What we might want to do in this case is use a different selector, right? So we could go for something a little bit more brittle and just say, okay, just give me the second input. In this case, I'm just going to reload the page, take the easy way out, since we actually do have an ID, both an ID and a placeholder, right, that we might use. I'm just going to use, in this case, the ID, right? I'm going to copy the ID here, and we can try out the script, see if that works. Yeah, looks like it worked. So the important takeaway here is you need to be creative. If your first selector doesn't work, if the wrong element is selected or you don't find an element, keep trying different things, right? Try to understand why that selector didn't work, but also don't get stuck. Feel free to experiment, try different things. In this case, another approach that we could take is maybe look into using a different engine rather than CSS. Maybe we could use XPath, which actually allows us to combine multiple conditions. So we might try and say, hey, I want the element with type password, which is not disabled, right? So that might be a way to differentiate between the two elements without using an index. We'll look into why using indexes is bad further on in the video. All right, XPath is a different selector engine, right? It's not CSS, it has a different set of features, it has a different syntax. The cool thing is Playwright will recognize it immediately. We'll see the different syntax and understand immediately what needs to happen under the hood, right? So I'm gonna use one of XPath's features, which essentially allows us to specify different Boolean conditions that an element needs to meet, right? So in this case, what we're gonna do is just ask to get an element anywhere it is in the DOM, right? And we're gonna, that element is gonna be of type input. If we go back to our Elements tab here, what we can see is that we're dealing with input fields, right? So we want then that input field to have a few different characteristics. So first of all, it needs to have type equal to password, right? So it needs to be of type password, but then we also want to have this not be a disabled field, right? This is what differentiates it from that hidden element that we've seen before. So here what I can do is just use the not operator and then specify an additional attribute, which is disabled. So we want it to not be disabled. Let's run that again and see. And you can see now things are working as expected. So we've already seen a little bit of CSS, a little bit of XPath. These actually are, merit their own videos, so we will dive into those deeper. But for now, let's just keep moving with our selectors. So next up is the sign in button element, right? So this we can just easily select. We can use our ID here and just be done with that. Or what we might want to do is use a yet different type of selector. We might use a Playwright text selector. So this is not CSS, it's not XPath, even though with XPath you can select elements based on their text content. In this case, we're gonna just use Playwright's own implementation. So what I'm gonna do is just copy the actual text here. I'm gonna go in here, back into my script, and just gonna wait page.click, because that's what we wanna do, right? And enter the selector. In this case, we can just do a text equals, and just enter the text value. Let's see how things go now. All right, as you can see, we logged in. That messed up our interface a little bit, as you can see, but everything is fine. We actually are logged into the platform, and that's great. Okay, so essentially we have tried 3 different selector engines at this point. We've tried good old CSS in the first 2 cases. We've tried XPath, and then we've had a first try of Playwright specific selectors. As you've seen, what I've done is essentially used the inspection capabilities of the Chrome DevTools here to just kind of navigate the source code and understand, or try and come up with selectors based on what is my knowledge. So as you become more proficient with HTML, CSS, automation, and so on and so forth, this will become kind of second nature to you. But it is a treacherous topic, selectors. It looks very simple. At the superficial level, it is a massive sticking point for beginners, and it's definitely something that can get quite intricate when you dive in deeper. And that is because we also need to get selectors right. It's not just enough to come up with any selector. So there's different ways that we can go about getting selectors right. I've shown you one. Before we jump into how to get selectors right, let's look at different ways that we can generate selectors. I could also actually, for example, select any element here and do a right click, copy selector, and then we would have a auto-generated selector for a specific element. And let's see what we got. Yeah, in this case, we got an ID, right? That's great. It's not always the case that auto-generated selectors are good, right? So what we could do is open up a different website. We can go to Playwright's own website, for example, pull out the inspector, select a random node, say this learn more here, and try and copy a selector from here, right? And this now doesn't look all that good, right? So we have a bunch of indexes, and the selector itself is rather long. So don't, when it comes to auto-generated selectors, you always have to audit them. You need to take a look at them, understand if they're brittle, right? If they're, in general, if they're too complex, if they leverage brittle things such as indexes and so on and so forth, and you might want to tweak these. Also, what we can do, which is very helpful for when you are just starting out with scripts, or you want to save time, because writing scripts is something that can take away quite some time. You can use a utility such as Headless Recorder, right? This is free and open source. It just installs to Chrome in this case. I can just click the record button here and say, try and go through the same flow that we've been through, right? I'm just gonna type in all the different strings here, and we're done with the flow. I'm gonna hit stop here, and now we have our output, right? And actually, you can see in this case we also have good selectors. So when IDs are available, the utility will pick it up on its own, right? Then we can just copy this code to clipboard and just essentially paste it, and it becomes our new script. All right, so we've seen different kinds of selectors, different engines, and different ways of going about finding the selectors. So there is an additional layer of complexity here. It's not just enough that we find a selector. There are, as you've already understood, multiple ways to select the same element. They're not all created equal, though. Ultimately, the selectors you choose to use in your scripts are what's going to determine how reliable, how stable your scripts run, how many headaches they will give you, at least in part, and how much maintenance will go into the scripts over their lifetime. So ideally, what we want is robust selectors from the beginning, right? So what are the attributes of a robust selector? I would say there's 3, or at least I use 3 as my guideline. The first one is uniqueness. So we want to have something that will reference the target element, what we want to select, and nothing else. IDs are most of the times unique, and therefore they would be our first choice. Unfortunately, they are not always available. Second attribute, it is stability, right? So we want something that is not likely to change over time. So the page again will get updated. Maybe we find something, some obscure attribute that is indeed unique, but actually it is perhaps auto-generated, right? Maybe next time the page gets deployed, that selector will not be relevant anymore. It won't be there anymore. That will break our script, right? And then we want conciseness. So in general, we want to have a selector that's as short as possible. That's easier to read, to understand, and therefore to replace, right? And in general, always keep in mind that we want, as in general with software engineering, we want to limit complexity where possible, right? So if we have a simpler solution that delivers the same result, we will go with that. So again, uniqueness, stability, and conciseness. Keep these 3 in mind when choosing a selector. Okay, so let's look at some examples of good and bad selectors. We're gonna record a random walk through Wikipedia. In this case, we're gonna use headless recorder, but similar results would be had with different tools. So I'm just gonna select the English version here, and I'm gonna just take a random walk again through the website, right? Just clicking a bunch around, and then just performing a search as well. And then we can actually stop. Okay, so we have a bunch of selectors here. Let's take a look and try to understand, try to criticize the good and the bad ones. So we have our first selector here. It's quite long. You can see that it's using the child operator here. So we have the child of one element, and then we go to its child, and so on and so forth. Immediately, what we should look for are IDs, right? So we have an ID here. So we're starting our descent with IDs. Again, IDs are unique, right? And then we have further down another ID, right? But if IDs are unique, then this initial part before the second ID is entirely useless, right? Because we could just start our descent from, well, the second unique item, right? So we can already immediately shorten this selector. Whether we need to keep the reference to the child of that ID depends on the element, right? Whether that's actually interactable in the way that we would like to. But in general, already if we achieve this level of simplification, this is already a nice step forward. Of course, first we want to test the initial selector, and then we want to immediately test the simplified selector. All right, this is the second selector. It's also pretty long, plus we have an index, right? We're looking for an element, and we're specifying which element it is by using an index. We can test the selector out and just take a look at how we can simplify it. You see it returns just one element. That's great. What if we removed everything before this class here, including the problematic index? Well, then we would get multiple elements, right? And in this case, we could just fetch the first one, right? Which actually would be the right one just by sheer coincidence, right? But that's not great, is it? So instead, let's try and see what else can be done here. So one idea could be to use the text of the element, right? So we could do a text equal Geneva. In this case, this is the name of a city, right? Maybe it doesn't change as much, but it will still change across different languages, right? If we go, for example, to the German page, you will see that, okay, so the element is not even in the same position, but we would have Genf, right, instead of Geneva. So the text for applications that need to be localized is definitely not ideal, right? So The text might be translated into different languages or might change for other reasons as well. So that's not ideal. And what else? We have the possibility to use the href, right? So essentially grab this via its link, right? And that's also not ideal, of course, but we won't always have an ideal way to reference an element, right? So another thing that we could do is just dive in a little bit deeper here and try to see if this element is somehow different from the other ones that come up in our search here, and try to find other differences. Maybe all the other elements would have an additional attribute set, and we could again use XPath and say I want this element which does not have that one attribute set, right? But in this case, as far as I can see at least, there is no immediate solution. And this is also why this is a creative endeavor, right? It's a little bit like, an art, I would say. You need to figure out a way to reference an element, and there's multiple ways that you can go about this. And sometimes it's like a real puzzle, right? The next selector was an ID. IDs are good, right? So provided that this was the right ID for the element, then we're good to go. We can keep that. All right, now let's move on to a different selector from a completely different website. This has a lot of problems, right? It's long, 5 steps here. We have classes that are named after strings that seem randomly generated, right? So this also calls into question the stability, of course, not just the conciseness of the whole thing. So if we can avoid this, of course, if we can find some other way to reference that one element, that of course is better. It might be that we need to get creative and look at other parameters that are not just the class, right? Just because this selector was suggested to us does not mean that it's the only way or the best available way to point to this item. Next up, we have something like this. So this is concise. So we're looking for an anchor element with a specific attribute, right? The problem is that this attribute is also probably gonna change, right? This looks like something that might be auto-generated, possibly by Vue.js in this case, right? Or a similar framework. So we again want to find a different way to select that anchor. Again, let's look past the suggested selector. There might be IDs or other parameters that we can focus on. Next up's another short one, right? So we're looking for a div with title equal to chat box. So this is the type of element we're looking for. This is the attribute, and this is the attribute value, right? So this is short, seems like it could be unique, right? And seems like it could be stable. So this one looks good so far. Next up, another simple short one. We're looking for, first of all, we're going through the navbar class, and then that should have a child of type button, right? We can see here already VS Code is helping us out in visualizing this, and then we would have, again, a button of class login, right? It might be that in the navbar there's something else that has this login class attached to it. So here we specify the element type, and that allows us to restrict the result. So this one also looks like it could be a decent selector in this case. All right, we could go on for a very long time with these examples. Might end up doing a complete video just on those, and in general, different selector engines probably require their own video as well. So maybe something for the future. For now, I hope that was a useful introduction to the very important topic of selectors. Probably more on this to come in the future. For the moment, thank you for your time. Thanks for listening.